All right, here's a quick review on graphing inverse trig functions. Okay, so we're going to graph today a secant. I chose a secant because the asymptote is not normally at x equals 0. So the same thing applies for both of the functions with y in the denominator, meaning cotangent and cosecant 1 over y. But secant and tangent have values that are not x equals 0 for asymptotes now. So that's gonna be dependent on this guy right here, the coefficient of the x value. I've factored it out for you already. Everyone's good at factoring that. That's good. So what you have to do is you have to think about the parent function of whichever reciprocal you are graphing. In this case, we're graphing secant. So normally my asymptote's negative pi over 2 right here. That asymptote is negative pi over 2. Let me put that in very thin. So that's negative pi over 2 normally. That's 0. That's pi over 2. And that's 3 pi over 2. You can see cosine in your mind right here. Let's see if we can put that in a fine green pen. You can see cosine kind of, if I can graph. All right, you can see, where's pen? Okay, you can see cosine lightly there. You can see that was not a good choice of color. Let's try a different color to go over that. That was okay. I'll just deal with this one. Okay, so there you can kind of see cosine there, you know. At its zeros, the asymptotes, they're dropping down. Actually, I'd like to not say zeros, I'd like to say midline points because that will help you later. At its midlines, the asymptotes are there. But this is, at this point, this graph is not part of what we're doing. So we're going to just kind of get rid of that. You know, we're just going to think about it, but not actually deal with it. Now, all right, let's get to work. So over here, let's do it in a black pen. So let's do it in that. So, so my asymptotes now, the key, the absolute key, absolute must, the absolute key here is start with your asymptote. Okay, absolutely. Okay, so let's see. My normal asymptote is at negative pi over 2 here. Stretch or compress horizontally based on that factor. So right here, I'm going twice as fast. So it's going to happen in half the distance. So, you know, your algebra teachers would have had you multiply your point, negative pi over 2, by the reciprocal of this, by the reciprocal of 2. So we'd multiply negative pi over 2. We'd be multiplying. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, negative pi over 2 is where it normally happens. I divide that by 2, which you and I call multiplying by the reciprocal of 2, 1/2. So that means my stretch or my compress is going to now happen at negative pi over 4. That's your first part. So what was at negative pi over 2 has been compressed to negative pi over 4. Then you've been moved right. This happens next. Then's your shift. So then you're moving right pi over 4. So let's think. So we were at negative pi over 2. We compressed it. That got us to negative pi over 4. Then we're going to move right, which you and I were moving right. It says right. That negative sign says right. Right pi over 4. So I'm going to move right pi over 4. Well, that's going to put us at 0. So now my first asymptote is going to happen at 0. So let's go ahead and drop an asymptote right there at 0. So let's see, what color should we put that in? So let's do that in, well, actually, let's keep it in black. How about that? Let's keep it in black. But then I'll make this really, I'll only take tiny little marks out of it there, showing that it's an asymptote. How about that? That will work. Okay, so that's an asymptote. Now, the next thing to do is go to the end. All right, so let's see. So this is why this is always on the board. So left asymptote is x equals 0. My right asymptote would be at the end of my period. So my period is going to be 2 pi divided by b. Secant is 2 pi. So my period is pi. So pi units later, I'm going to have my ending asymptote. That's this one right here. This one has now come in half the distance because of my speed. It's come in half the distance, is now located at pi. So let's treat let's treat every tick mark as pi over 2. So that means that's pi over 2 pi. Maybe I could probably do every 2 tick marks is, let's do it. Every 2 tick marks is pi over 2. So that would be right there as pi. Let's drop that down. Okay, and let's do a little eraser on that. Okay, so my right asymptote's pi. It's marked right there. We may be tinily off the line, but you're going to get your credit. You've got your marked right here. Now, then really from there, it's easy. Your middle asymptote, well, halfway in between 0 and pi is halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. So let's move that. Let's get my little eraser here. Oops, a daisy. Still learning this. Working all weekend on kind of getting this down. All right, so there we go. Now, looking at, now I can hide my ruler, get that away. So now, between the left asymptote and the middle asymptote, can you see me moving up here in the top corner? Looking at my parent function, seeing over here. So then between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, I have an upcut, right? And that is 1 unit. Its trough point is 1 unit above the midline. And my midline is 1. My midline is 1. So my midline is going to be 1. And I'm going to be 1 unit above that, stretched by a height of 2. So vertically stretched. That vertical 1 above the midline is now going to be 2 above the midline. So there's my point. Sorry, my x coordinate should have been pi over 2 there. Then my trough point, now that's a point, a key in the name. Trough point happens at pi over 4, because that's halfway the distance between 0 and pi over 2, and it's up a height of 3 because it was 2 units above the midline. Now my peak point, now that's going to be, that's this is the terminology we've been using. That's the peak of the down cup right there, is halfway between the next asymptotes, or halfway between the next asymptotes between pi over 2 and pi is 3 pi over 4. And that is 2 units stretched, 2 units below the midline. So that would be there. Oops, it wasn't the best looking cup, but that's okay. We've got our point here. So we know at halfway between pi over 2 and pi, which is 3 pi over 4, I have a height of 2 units below the midline, so that's negative 1. And that's all there is to it. So the key, start with your asymptotes. Shrink or compress appropriately. Account for your phase shift. Drop your asymptote. Once you've got your asymptote, mark your point down, then go beginning, end. End is your period distance away. Once you've done that, start cutting it up into sections. There's your middle, there's your quarter 1, there's your quarter 3, and drop the points accordingly.